Morning. We're joined now by former Army Chief Lord Dannett, Richard Dannett. We're going to get on to talking about defence in just a moment. Firstly, though, Lord Dannett, can we ask your reaction to the news of Theresa May's resignation this morning?
Well, I think it's not surprising. She is of a certain age and has said that she's got other interests that she wants to follow. She's been Prime Minister, so she's reached the top. So I think it's a dignified exit. I think as far as her time as Prime Minister is concerned, she took on what is always an extraordinarily difficult job at an extraordinarily difficult time when the Conservative Party wanted about 4 or 5 different things all at the same time. And that's an almost impossible act to try and juggle. So I think, as other speakers have been saying, she has done her best. I think she will get reasonable reviews in history. But I think we thank her for her service. We thank her for her attempts to do the right thing in the interests of our country. And I think, being generous, we wish her well in her retirement from the House of Commons.
Jonathan, if I can ask you about this 29 billion black hole in our defence spending, how bad is this for not just our government, but for our country?
Well, black holes in the Ministry of Defence's budget are not new. When the Conservative Party came in 2010, a similar sized black hole was inherited from the outgoing Labour government. So this is not a new situation. But I think the distinguishing feature about this Public Affairs Committee report that's been published this morning is that the plans the Ministry of Defence have been making have been based on a defence expenditure of around 2.5% of GDP, when in fact we are currently spending somewhere between 2.2 and 2.3. The point being is that there are many plans that have been made for capital investment, capital improvement, equipment improvement over the next 10 years, particularly towards the end of this decade, and there just isn't the money there to fund them. So what that translates is into lots of hopes being raised that new equipment, which is desperately needed, is going to be coming to the Army, Navy and the Air Force, but the money isn't there to provide it, which gets us back to the discussion that many of us have been trying to engage the government with in recent years, is to ask the question, are we spending enough on defence? Yeah. And many commentators, including myself, would say, no, we're not. We should be spending around 2.5%, maybe going up to 3%, because the world that we're living in is a very insecure place. And particularly the war in Ukraine is threatening our security and threatening the security of Europe.
Yeah, and that 2.5% figure, Lord Dannett, that you quote, will only be reached if the fiscal and economic circumstances allow. It's a big if, isn't it? And that means that defence commitments are effectively a wish list. But the timing of this, coming as we've had the Defence Secretary talking about us being in a pre-war world, and the numbers don't seem to match that rhetoric, do they? How concerned should we be?
Well, I think we've got a right to be fairly concerned, but I think it's a concern that should be addressed and dealt with. I know it's a common thing currently to reflect back to the 1930s as an example, but in 1935, when this country was wondering how to confront Hitler as a dictator, we were actually spending at that point somewhere just less than 3% of GDP on defence. When appeasement failed and he became aggressive and war broke out, we were then spending in 1939 18%, and then by 1940, when we were fighting for our survival, it was 46%. Those are the costs of having to fight a disastrous war. But the real point is we need to spend enough to deter further aggression. In this case, it's from Vladimir Putin and from Russia. So the bottom line is we're not spending enough on defence now. If that continues and we get sucked into a ghastly war, that'll be disastrous for our finances. So we've got to be prepared to pay a larger premium to deter war. And that premium is around about 2.5% to 3%. That's what the government has got to confront. And the next government, whoever it might be, has got to confront it as well.
Well, Russia are spending a third of their government's money on the war efforts, a whole third. We're nowhere near that, but are they ahead of us? Are we underprepared?
Well, I mean, that's the basic point I was making. Russia, through its own decisions, is now locked in a war that's costing itself a tremendous amount of money in blood and treasure. So their spending on defence has had to go up to about a third. Reflect back to what I said just now. 1939, we spent 18%, 1940, 46%. We were in that position then because we were fighting a war. They're fighting a war, albeit of their choosing. And goodness knows how the Ukrainian economy is being absolutely crucified at the present moment. But the critical thing is that we support the Ukrainians to effectively defeat Russia in Ukraine now, but also make sure that our military capability in the air, at sea, and on the land is sufficiently strong to deter further aggression.
Jonathan.
And I'm afraid the price for that deterrence is greater than 2.2%.
How do we compare then to our European neighbours and our fellow NATO members, Lord Dannett?
How do we prepare?
How do we compare?
Compare. Well, we are amongst those nations in NATO that are above the 2% NATO figure. But bear in mind that 2% NATO figure is a minimum. It shouldn't be seen as the target. It is a minimum. And of course, you have to look at Britain's standing in the world. We are, have always been, the leading military power amongst the European members of NATO. We've got wider security considerations. We aspire to be what is called a tier 1 military capability nation. And frankly, we're not at the present moment. So it comes back to my basic point, and there is another point which I'll come back to in just a moment, that we come back to my basic point that we need to play our role in deterring further aggression in Europe. And currently, our overall capability, particularly on land, does not allow us to do that. And the other point I would just make is that years ago, when we were investing in our nuclear deterrent, this came from a separate funding line from the Treasury. Now, the replacement of our nuclear deterrent, and this report bears this out, comes from within the Ministry of Defence's own budget. So the expenditure on nuclear deterrence is, I'm afraid, at the cost of conventional deterrence. And those sums just are not adding up.
Lord Dannett, if we were to get more spending on our military, would it be better to spend it on less soldiers who are better trained with the absolutely best equipment, or is it just a case of we need more men on the ground?
Well, if you're asking about soldiers, the answer is both. The numeric size of the army is not sufficient, and the equipment that the army has got has been woefully underinvested in. There are many programs that the army is looking forward to over the next 10 years, but only 20% of those are currently out to contract. And that means the other 80% are likely to be victims of what this report is saying, that there just isn't the money to pay for them. Now, that's not good enough. And when you've got a brutal land war in Europe, we've got to make sure that at very least our army is capable of standing alongside other European armies to deter further Russian aggression.
Lord Dannett and Jonathan Haslam still in the studio with us. Thank you both very much indeed.